Nahverkehr Dresden, otherwise known as Riesa to Dresden, is a German route released in September 2021 as part of the TSW2 Rush Hour series. Apparently this route was upgraded for TSW4, but I haven't noticed any major differences between the current version and the original, aside from the lighting. I've had the idea to review this route for ages now, but for various reasons, work on the review has taken much longer than expected. This is one of the best examples of a non-linear route that I could think of. Besides the main line from Dresden Hauptbahnhof to Riesa via Radebeul Ost and Kostweg, which is around 53 kilometers long, you also get the branches from Kostweg to Meissen and Prestowitz to Grossenhain. The latter goes under the diversionary route for faster trains. Said diversion leaves the main line just east of Kostweg and meets the slow line again near Nürnkreuz. There's also a short branch to Roderau, which is exclusively used by freight trains. Lastly, the sidings at the Nürnkreuz chemical plant are also included. In my opinion, this is one of the best routes in TSW solely for the wide variety of services you can run on it. You've got S-bahn, DB Regional, Intercity and Intercity Express passenger services as well as several freight trains, although the IC and ICE services are only available as timetable mode layers if you've got the BR406 ICE3M from Köln to Aachen and the original BR101. I don't know if the expert BR101 layers onto this route as well. As for the freight services, these include shunts from Riesa to the Nürnkreuz chemical plant and back with an old 060 diesel locomotive, quite a contrast to the electric hauled services. While Riesa to Dresden does include a sizable amount of motive power, none of the classes were actually new to TSW at the time of the route's release. You get the BR442 Talent 2 electric multiple unit, plus BR143, BR146-2, and MRCE BR185-5 electric locomotives, as well as the BR363 diesel shunter. You also get yet another rehash of the overused Doppelstockwagen coaches, but at the very least, these ones have slightly altered liveries with region-specific decals, instead of just having the bog-standard DB Regio branding. The Talent 2 has already appeared in two previous route add-ons, namely S-Bahn Mitteldeutschland, aka Rapid Transit, and Schnellfahrstrecke Köln, but each variant of the unit in TSW is distinctly different from the other two. In the case of Nahverkehr Dresden, we get the 3-car BR442-1 variant in Deutsche Bahn red livery, with the addition of region-specific VVO branding. Dovetail missed a trick by not including the 5-car BR442-3 variant, which also runs regional services out of Dresden along with its shorter counterpart. The BR143 locomotive and Doppelstockwagen coaches were first introduced with the Ruhr-Sieg Nord route in 2018, while the BR146-2 was first introduced with Main-Spessartbahn in 2019. In this add-on, she is used to haul S-Bahn Dresden and a few regional services alongside the BR143, and although she has a distinctive motor sound, the BR146-2 is otherwise a very bland locomotive. As for the MRCE BR185-5, this is another locomotive that just exists, like Season 10 of Thomas the Tank Engine, and this locomotive is reused from Rhein-Ruhr-Osten, otherwise known as the Wuppertal to Hagen route. Feel free to check out my review of that add-on, published in November 2023. The BR363 diesel shunter has been in TSW since November 2020, when she was released in Deutsche Bahn Red as an add-on for Ruhr-Sieg Nord. She had a livery change for Riesa to Dresden, and Dovetail would go on to recycle and resell this reskin 2 more times, in the Dresden to Chemnitz and Aschaffenburg to Miltenberg routes. It's odd seeing the BR363 in this older livery, as she looks out of place amongst the other locomotives in modern liveries. Although incidentally, I don't know what time period the Riesa to Dresden route is set in. Thinking back to the BR143, I noticed a while back that her model in TSW only depicts the original members of the class built between 1985 and 1987. Starting with locomotive number 143302-8, those built between 1987 and 1991 had a slightly altered cab front. And based on real Dresden S-bahn footage that I've seen elsewhere on YouTube, you'll often see those later BR143s running the show. Examples include locomotives 143884-5, 143910-8, and 143973-6. I'm disappointed in the lack of those higher numbered BR143s in TSW. Instead, the model included with Nahverkehr Dresden only displays numbers in the 143100 and 143200 ranges. Timetable mode features 178 playable services for the BR143, 45 for the BR146-2, 129 for the BR185-5, 12 for the BR363, 81 for the BR442 Talent 2, and 108 for the Doppelstockwagen cab car when she's leading. If you select a service with the cab car leading, then the game will load a BR143 or BR146-2 as the accompanying locomotive. Services on S-bahn line S1 are typically formed of 4 coaches with a BR146-2, while services on lines S2 and S3 typically have a BR143 with only 2 coaches. In the case of all 3 lines, the locomotive is traditionally at the southern or Dresden end, while the cab car is at the northern end. Curiously, when the BR363 is out on the main line between Riesa and the chemical plant, she is restricted to only 55 km per hour, while the normal speed limit along this section is 120. Unfortunately, this chemical plant shunt is the only thing you can do with the BR363 on this route. She doesn't have services anywhere else, and come to think of it, most, if not all, of the standard freight services with the electric locomotives in timetable mode are simple point A to point B runs. Meanwhile, you'll see wagons parked in the sidings at Kosvik, but you can't do any shunting here in timetable mode, only in one of the scenarios, if I recall correctly. Locomotives and units from other German add-ons, such as the BR406 ICE-3M, BR101, BR155, BR182, and BR193 Vectron, layer or substitute onto this route in timetable mode if you own them as well. This significantly increases the variety of motive power you'll potentially see on the route, but most of the time when I was recording footage for this review, the boring old MRCE BR185-5 was the most common sight at the head of freight trains, with occasional exceptions from the Deutsche Bahn BR185-2, BR143, BR112, and even the Railpool BR185-6 at one point. Meanwhile, the ICE-3M is used to represent the Dresden to Frankfurt Flughafen service, but she still only has destination options for Brussels and Frankfurt am Main Hauptbahnhof, as that was all she needed when she first appeared in TSW. As for why Dovetail have never updated the ICE-3M's destination options, I have no idea. And curiously, the BR403 ICE-3 from München to Augsburg does not layer onto Riesa to Dresden, nor does the BR401 ICE-1 from Kassel to Würzburg. When this route was originally released, it did not include the Meissen branch. This extension was added some time after the initial release, and from what I remember, DTG allowed people to vote on whether they wanted a Meissen or Dresden Flughafen added to the route, Flughafen being the German word for airport. Whilst I think the Meissen branch is pleasant enough, especially when you cross the bridge over the Elbe River, I'm disappointed that we never got to run the S-bahn S2 services past Dresden Neustadt as well. Although that branch's omission was apparently due to light baking issues, whatever that means, in the Dresden airport tunnel. I don't bother running that little section of S2 in timetable mode because of how short it is. You can only run that service between Dresden Hauptbahnhof and Dresden Neustadt, with 2 intermediate stops at Dresden Freiburger Straße and Dresden Mitte. In contrast to S2, we get a significantly longer portion of the S1 line with Nahverkehr Dresden, but only between Meissen-Triebischtal and Dresden Hauptbahnhof, a distance of 28 kilometers. In real life, the line continues much further south than Dresden Hauptbahnhof, terminating 77 kilometers south of Meissen-Triebischtal at Schöne. DTG would go on to revisit Dresden with their Taranto Ramp route, released in January 2022. This one is set in 2012, and runs for 79 kilometers through the winding river valley across to Chemnitz. Amongst other things, the add-on includes the BR612 diesel multiple unit and the full S-bahn S3 service from Dresden Hauptbahnhof to Freiburg, although most S3 services only go as far as Tarant. I was initially fascinated by the Dresden S-bahn. Unlike most S-bahn systems throughout Germany, such as those in Berlin and Frankfurt am Main, the Dresden system uses locomotive-hauled trains with cab cars, or in other words, push-pull consists. I find this especially odd when you're using the BR143, which, in my opinion, is difficult to drive. As a brief aside, the continued lack of a Berlin S-bahn route in TSW is ridiculous. In stark contrast to the Dresden area, Riesa station is very quiet, and only 2 of its platforms are regularly used by passenger trains in timetable mode. Besides the RE50, the only other passenger services that go all the way out here are the Intercity and Intercity Express trains. As for what the RE50 is, that's an hourly regional service from Dresden to Leipzig. Thinking back to the BR143 yet again, the version included with this route is a noticeable improvement on the original Ruhr-Sieg Nord version, which I considered to be too simple. The Dresden version has better sounds and more functionality, including a reverser lever and brake key that you can actually insert when you set up the locomotive. Now if only Dovetail could finally add that missing variant with numbers in the 143-800 and 143-900 range. I thought the scenery quality was rather inconsistent throughout the route. In the case of the foliage, this is made worse by the draw distance. As you drive along, you can clearly see these assets fade into existence only a short distance ahead of you. Some embankments along the fast line, or as I've started calling it, the Kosweg avoiding line, don't have any foliage details at all. And overall, I think the foliage details are at their worst along the Kosweg avoiding line. Even without the draw distance issue, which is not isolated to this one route, I still noticed a few other areas of lousy foliage detail. For example, the fields right next to Radebeul Kutschenbroda, and on both sides of the track on the spur leading into the Nürnkreuz chemical plant. I also noticed this bright orange building next to Radebeul Zitzscheweg station. For some reason, it was copied and pasted just east of Radebeul Ost, only 3 stations back towards Dresden. This isn't the only case of a reused asset on this route. They're actually fairly common. Meanwhile, the immediate surroundings of Radebeul Ost make the station feel quite lifeless. It's right next to a narrow gauge yard, as this is the interchange with the Lößnitzgrundbahn, a 16.9 km long railway running up to Radeburg on 750mm gauge. The sidings are completely empty in game, as DTG did not model any narrow gauge rolling stock at the time. Given that DTG would go on to model a static narrow gauge coach for Dresden to Chemnitz, it would be nice to get some German narrow gauge routes in TSW, such as the Lößnitzgrundbahn or the Brockenbahn, especially if it means you get to see those really bulky 210-2 steam locomotives. But considering the fact that Dovetail quietly abandoned steam locomotive development for TSW earlier in 2024, I doubt we'll ever see a narrow gauge German route in the game anytime soon, if at all. In real life, the road outside Dresden Hauptbahnhof is very busy with buses and a tram line passing by, but this is what it looks like in TSW. I've heard of inaccurate recreations, but this is ridiculous. Maybe Dovetail thought that no one would bother looking round this side of the station, which would be a feeble excuse if that's what they were actually thinking. In any case, the scenery directly to the north of the station is pretty awful, as seen in this screenshot. Elsewhere in the real station, specifically in a corner by the low-level platforms, there's actually a model railway on display, but it's nowhere to be seen in TSW. In any case, that real layout reminds me of this N-scale German layout I saw at an exhibition earlier in 2024. There was an absurd amount of missing overhead wires on the pre-TSW4 version of this route. Most of it appears to have been fixed during the remastering, but during this review's production, I noticed that at least 4 cases of missing OHLEs still exist on this route. 2 of them are on the fast lines between Dresden Bischofsplatz and Dresden Peichen, while the 3rd is on the Meissen branch between Neuslönowitz and Meissen itself. The 4th is just outside Dresden Hauptbahnhof, more specifically, under this bridge at the western end of the station. Even though it's harder to see if you're rigidly focused on driving the train, any amount of missing OHLE still being on this route is very annoying. Elsewhere, there are still some important details that Dovetail didn't screw up, such as the Jenitze building near Dresden Mitte. Apparently, this is a former cigarette factory that's been converted into a restaurant, although I thought it was a church at first. For the most part, the stations are very well modelled, with Dresden Neustadt being my favourite out of all the stations on this route. Although I'm fine with the route coverage as it is now, it would have been even better if DTG had also extended the route coverage to Leipzig Hauptbahnhof, which is only around 50 kilometers from Riesa. That way, it could have linked up with the rapid transit route, and you'd also be able to drive the entire RE50 passenger service between Dresden and Leipzig, instead of having the journey cut short at Riesa. Incidentally, there is a Leipzig to Dresden route in TS Classic, complete with S-bahn Mitteldeutschland Talent 2 variants that are inexplicably missing in TSW, but Dovetail never bothered to extend the TSW route past Riesa. A lot of their decisions on what they do and don't include in this game don't make any sense. At the end of the day, I still think Nahverkehr Dresden is a good route because of its non-linear nature, mostly lively rail scene and healthy service variation. It's good to have the option to run freight trains as well, but my preference will always be the passenger services, especially those with the Talent 2.